In May 1940, as German armored divisions tore through the Low Countries and France collapsed with shocking speed, Britain stood on the edge of strategic disaster. The evacuation at Dunkirk had saved hundreds of thousands of soldiers, but it had not delivered victory. Across the English Channel, the most powerful military machine in Europe was consolidating control, and invasion seemed not only possible, but imminent. Inside Westminster, political confidence faltered as rapidly as the continent had fallen. Amid this crisis, a familiar but controversial figure rose to the highest office of the British government: Winston Churchill. He was not the first choice of many in Parliament, nor was he universally trusted after years of political isolation and past miscalculations. Yet he possessed something few others did in that moment: an unshakable belief that Nazi Germany could and must be resisted at all costs. While some voices quietly explored the possibility of negotiation, Churchill rejected compromise as a path to national survival. Britain, in 1940, faced not only military threat, but psychological collapse. The British Expeditionary Force had retreated. France, long considered a pillar of European stability, was disintegrating. Air raid sirens would soon become part of daily life. The empire stretched across oceans, but the homeland itself was vulnerable, exposed to aerial bombardment and potential invasion. The future of liberal democracy in Europe appeared to hang by a thread. Churchill understood that weapons alone would not determine Britain's fate. Morale would be decisive. He approached leadership not merely as administration, but as performance and persuasion. In the House of Commons and over the radio waves of the BBC, he began shaping a narrative of defiance, not naive optimism, but disciplined resolve. He did not promise quick victory. He promised struggle. At a moment when defeat seemed plausible and accommodation tempting, Churchill framed resistance as a moral obligation rather than a strategic gamble. Britain, he argued, was not fighting only for territory, but for the survival of its institutions and the balance of power in Europe. His voice, gravelly, deliberate, unmistakable, would soon become a weapon as potent as any aircraft or battleship. The story of Churchill in World War II begins not with triumph, but with uncertainty. It begins in a chamber thick with tension, in a nation bracing for assault, and in the mind of a leader who believed that surrender would mean the end of something far greater than empire. Before victory could be imagined, survival had to be declared. On 13 May 1940, only days after taking office, Winston Churchill stood before the House of Commons to deliver his first speech as Prime Minister. The circumstances were stark. German forces were advancing relentlessly across Western Europe, and Britain faced the prospect of fighting alone. There would be no triumphant promises, no illusions of swift reversal. Instead, Churchill chose blunt honesty, offering the nation what he famously described as blood, toil, tears, and sweat. It was not a slogan of comfort, but a declaration of endurance. The power of the speech did not lie in theatrical exaggeration, but in clarity of purpose. Churchill framed the conflict as a test of will and survival, reducing the situation to its moral core. Victory, he insisted, was the only objective, because without victory there would be no survival for Britain or for the ideals it claimed to defend. In a chamber accustomed to procedural debate, his words cut through uncertainty with controlled urgency. At that moment, Britain's strategic position was precarious. The British Expeditionary Force was still engaged on the continent, and the collapse of France appeared increasingly likely. Military planners feared that a German invasion of the British Isles could follow swiftly. Within the War Cabinet, some figures quietly considered whether negotiation through intermediaries might preserve elements of British sovereignty. Churchill rejected this line of thought, believing that compromise would ultimately reduce Britain to dependency under Nazi dominance. The speech marked a psychological turning point. Rather than conceal the scale of danger, Churchill confronted it openly, transforming fear into a shared national commitment. His rhetoric established a tone that would define Britain's wartime identity: sober, resolute, and defiant. He did not promise comfort. He promised struggle and framed that struggle as meaningful. Radio carried his message beyond Parliament, reaching homes and factories across the country. In kitchens, workshops, and airfields, citizens listened to the cadence of his voice and sensed that the government would not falter. In the weeks ahead, Britain would face evacuation at Dunkirk and the threat of aerial bombardment. But before those trials unfolded, Churchill had already defined the emotional landscape in which they would be endured. The speech did not change the balance of forces on the battlefield. It did something more subtle and perhaps more powerful. It anchored national morale to the idea that resistance was both necessary and honorable. In doing so, Churchill began transforming language into strategy and words into instruments of war. By late May 1940, the situation on the continent had deteriorated with breathtaking speed. German armored divisions had outmaneuvered Allied defenses, cutting off large elements of the British Expeditionary Force along the northern coast of France. The port town of Dunkirk became the focal point of a desperate effort to extract hundreds of thousands of trapped soldiers before they were encircled and captured. For Britain, the stakes were existential. The loss of its core army would leave the homeland exposed to invasion. As reports reached London, the scale of the crisis became clear to Winston Churchill and his war cabinet. Military planners warned that only a fraction of the stranded troops might realistically be evacuated. German air superiority and advancing ground forces threatened to turn the beaches into a catastrophe. Yet rather than concede inevitability, Churchill authorized a bold and improvised operation that would come to be known as Operation Dynamo. What followed was a remarkable mobilization of naval vessels, merchant ships, and civilian boats that crossed the English Channel under constant threat. Destroyers and trawlers navigated smoke and chaos, while soldiers waited in disciplined lines along the shoreline, aware that rescue was uncertain. The Royal Air Force fought to protect evacuation routes, often unseen by the troops below, but critical in limiting German air attacks. Each successful crossing represented not victory, but preservation, the saving of men who would fight another day. When the evacuation concluded in early June, more than 300,000 Allied soldiers had been brought safely to Britain's shores. The scale of the rescue astonished observers and provided a surge of relief to a nation bracing for the worst. Yet Churchill was careful not to mistake survival for triumph. In the House of Commons, he described the operation as a miracle of deliverance, but reminded Parliament that wars are not won by evacuations. Dunkirk became both a symbol and a warning. It demonstrated resilience, improvisation, and collective effort at a moment of profound vulnerability. At the same time, it underscored how close Britain had come to strategic collapse. The army had been saved, but equipment had been abandoned, and continental Europe was falling under German control. The nation's fate would soon depend not on retreat, but on its ability to withstand direct assault. For Churchill, Dunkirk reinforced his conviction that morale must never outrun reality. The rescue offered hope, but it also demanded preparation for darker trials ahead. The next phase of the war would not unfold on distant beaches, but in British skies and cities. The struggle for survival was far from over. It was only beginning. On the 4th of June 1940, as the last ships returned from Dunkirk and the scale of evacuation became known, Winston Churchill rose again in the House of Commons. The rescue of hundreds of thousands of soldiers had prevented immediate disaster, yet the strategic picture remained bleak. France was collapsing, and Britain faced the possibility of standing alone against a dominant continental power. The moment demanded not celebration, but clarity, and Churchill delivered one of the most defining speeches of the 20th century. In measured, deliberate cadence, he acknowledged both relief and danger. He warned that what had occurred was a miracle of deliverance, yet he refused to disguise the magnitude of the threat. The German army remained poised across the Channel, and invasion plans were under serious consideration in Berlin. Britain's coastlines, once symbols of insular security, now appeared as potential landing grounds. Then came the words that would echo across generations. Britain would fight on the beaches, on the landing grounds, in the fields, and in the streets. The repetition was not accidental. It was rhetorical fortification. Each clause reinforced the idea that resistance would extend to every corner of national life. Surrender was never mentioned as an option because in Churchill's framework, it did not exist. The speech carried particular weight within the War Cabinet, where debate had quietly surfaced about whether mediation through neutral powers might preserve peace. Churchill's position was uncompromising. Negotiation under duress would invite domination. His language reframed the crisis as a moral confrontation rather than a diplomatic puzzle. The struggle was not merely territorial. It concerned the future of European liberty and the balance of power itself. Radio broadcasts carried his words beyond Parliament into homes, factories, and military posts. Civilians who had feared isolation heard instead a declaration of collective resolve. The speech did not promise safety. It promised endurance. In doing so, Churchill transformed a strategic setback into a narrative of national identity rooted in defiance. This address marked a psychological consolidation of Britain's wartime stance. If Dunkirk had been a rescue from disaster, the Beaches speech was a pledge of resistance. It signaled that the coming months would test the nation directly, and that leadership would not waver when that test arrived. The battle for survival was no longer distant. It was imminent. By the summer of 1940, the threat that had loomed since Dunkirk materialized in the skies above southern England. The German High Command prepared Operation Sea Lion, a planned invasion that depended on first securing air superiority over Britain. The task fell to the Luftwaffe, whose bombers and fighters crossed the Channel in coordinated waves, targeting airfields, radar stations, and aircraft production facilities. The fate of the nation now hinged not on armies maneuvering across continents, but on the outcome of an aerial campaign fought at breathtaking speed. Winston Churchill understood that this battle would test both military capability and national endurance. Britain's Royal Air Force was numerically inferior, and losses in aircraft and pilots mounted steadily in the early weeks. Yet technological advantages, including an integrated radar defense network and coordinated command structures, allowed the RAF to respond with disciplined precision. The struggle became a contest of attrition, fought in shifting clouds above villages, coastlines, and industrial towns. As the bombing intensified, civilian life was transformed. Air raid sirens punctuated daily routines, and families sought shelter in underground stations and reinforced basements. Factories continued production under threat, and emergency services operated through smoke and debris. The war was no longer distant. It had reached the British mainland, embedding itself into the rhythms of everyday existence. The psychological strain was immense, yet so too was the sense of collective participation. Churchill's role during the Battle of Britain extended beyond strategic oversight. Visiting damaged neighborhoods and RAF command centers, he reinforced a visible connection between leadership and resilience. In Parliament, he delivered another defining line. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. The phrase elevated fighter pilots into symbols of national defense, crystallizing public admiration and sustaining morale during relentless bombardment. The Luftwaffe shifted tactics from military targets to urban centers, initiating what became known as the Blitz. London, Coventry, and other cities endured sustained night raids that inflicted heavy destruction. Yet German objectives, breaking civilian morale and crippling industrial capacity, proved elusive. Britain's air defenses adapted and production continued despite damage. The anticipated collapse did not occur. By the autumn of 1940, the balance in the skies began to tilt. German losses increased, and the prospect of invasion receded. The Battle of Britain did not end the war, but it marked the first major check on Nazi expansion. It demonstrated that the German war machine was not invincible, and that resistance, if organized and sustained, could prevail. For Churchill, it was confirmation that defiance had been more than rhetoric. It had become reality. When the Luftwaffe shifted its focus from airfields to cities in September 1940, the character of the war over Britain changed dramatically. Night after night, waves of bombers crossed the Channel under cover of darkness, targeting London, Liverpool, Birmingham, and industrial centers across the country. Fires illuminated the skyline, and the steady drone of engines became an almost constant presence. The campaign, later known as the Blitz, sought to break civilian morale and disrupt the industrial backbone that sustained British resistance. Winston Churchill recognized that this phase of the conflict would test the nation's psychological resilience as much as its military capacity. Bomb damage was visible in shattered streets and blackened facades, but the deeper objective was fear. Families descended into underground stations each evening, carrying blankets and essentials, transforming platforms into makeshift dormitories. Above ground, fire brigades and emergency workers operated through smoke and debris, often continuing rescue efforts while raids were still underway. The destruction was significant. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble, and historic landmarks suffered severe damage. Yet daily life did not collapse. Public transport resumed each morning, factories reopened, and newspapers continued to print. The British government implemented rationing and civil defense measures, reinforcing the idea that discipline and cooperation were essential components of survival. The Blitz forged a shared experience that blurred distinctions between front line and home front. Churchill made frequent visits to bombed districts, appearing among civilians in damaged streets. These appearances were carefully observed and widely reported, reinforcing the perception that leadership stood alongside the population rather than removed from it. His speeches during this period avoided exaggerated optimism. Instead, he framed endurance as a form of quiet heroism, praising the steadiness of ordinary citizens who refused to yield to intimidation. The Blitz failed in its primary objective. German planners had anticipated that sustained bombing would force political concessions or provoke panic. Instead, the raids hardened British resolve and strengthened the narrative of national unity under siege. While losses were painful and rebuilding would take years, the social fabric held. In enduring the Blitz, Britain demonstrated that total war demanded collective resilience. The experience deepened public commitment to the struggle and confirmed Churchill's conviction that morale could outlast destruction. The skies remained dangerous, but the attempt to break the nation's spirit had not succeeded. The voice that had called for defiance now echoed in the lived determination of millions. While bombs fell on British cities and fighter planes dueled in the skies above the Channel, another battle unfolded far from public view across the vast, cold expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. Britain, as an island nation, depended on maritime supply routes for food, fuel, and raw materials essential to survival. Without secure shipping lanes, resistance would falter regardless of courage or rhetoric. German U-boats, operating in coordinated patrols, sought to sever this lifeline and starve Britain into submission. Winston Churchill later admitted that the Battle of the Atlantic was the only campaign that truly frightened him. Each convoy lost represented not only sunk vessels, but reduced reserves and mounting pressure on the home front. Merchant sailors faced relentless danger in freezing waters, navigating through storms and torpedo threats alike. Destroyers and escort vessels hunted submarines with depth charges, while intelligence units worked to decipher enemy communications. Rationing tightened across Britain as the strain on imports increased. Bread, meat, sugar, and fuel were carefully allocated, and citizens adapted to reduced consumption as a matter of routine. Posters urged vigilance, blackouts concealed coastal lights, and shipyards operated around the clock to replace losses. The war at sea became a contest of endurance and innovation, where radar improvements, convoy systems, and code-breaking efforts gradually shifted the balance. Churchill's leadership during this period reflected a broader strategic awareness. He understood that Britain's survival required not only internal resilience but external partnership. Close coordination with the United States intensified even before America formally entered the war. Naval cooperation, material assistance, and shared intelligence formed the foundation of what would become a decisive transatlantic alliance. The Atlantic struggle extended beyond ships and submarines. It symbolized the interconnected nature of modern warfare. Industrial production in North America, maritime routes across icy waters, and dock workers in British ports were all part of a single strategic chain. If that chain failed, isolation would follow. By 1941 and 1942, technological adaptation and Allied coordination began to blunt the U-boat threat. Losses remained high, but supply lines held. Britain did not starve. The island endured, sustained by convoys that crossed hostile seas in disciplined formation. In preserving the Atlantic lifeline, Churchill's government secured the material foundation upon which broader Allied victory would eventually rest. Long before the United States formally entered the war, Winston Churchill understood that Britain's long-term survival depended on American partnership. Across the Atlantic, President Franklin D. Roosevelt faced domestic pressures that limited direct military involvement, yet he shared Churchill's concern about the expansion of Nazi power. Through letters, cables, and carefully managed public signals, the two leaders began constructing a relationship that would reshape the global balance of power. In 1941, their cooperation deepened through the Lend-Lease program, which provided Britain with ships, aircraft, food, and industrial materials. While technically framed as assistance rather than alliance, the policy signaled a strategic alignment that transcended neutrality. Churchill described the program as the most unsordid act in history, recognizing that material support bought time, and time was Britain's most precious resource. The Atlantic was no longer merely a defensive frontier. It became a bridge of coordination. The relationship between Churchill and Roosevelt extended beyond policy into personal diplomacy. Their meeting aboard warships off the coast of Newfoundland in August 1941 produced the Atlantic Charter, a statement of shared principles about post-war order and collective security. Although the United States had not yet declared war, the document outlined commitments to self-determination and economic cooperation. It hinted at a future shaped not by imperial rivalry, but by structured partnership. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 transformed cooperation into formal alliance. With the United States now fully engaged, Britain was no longer isolated. Churchill traveled repeatedly to Washington, strengthening strategic coordination and military planning. Joint command structures and shared intelligence accelerated the development of a unified Allied strategy that spanned Europe, Africa, and the Pacific. This alliance altered the trajectory of the war. Industrial production in the United States surged, creating an arsenal that dwarfed Axis capacity. Britain's resilience, sustained through 1940 and 1941, now linked to American power in a transatlantic coalition capable of sustained offensive operations. Churchill's early insistence on resistance had preserved a platform from which global partnership could emerge. The bond between Churchill and Roosevelt did not eliminate disagreements, but it anchored the Allied cause in a shared vision of defeating totalitarian expansion. Together, they forged a wartime alignment that extended beyond immediate survival toward shaping the peace that would follow. In securing American partnership, Churchill ensured that Britain's voice would not fade. It would resonate within a coalition strong enough to challenge Hitler's dominance. By 1942, the war had expanded across continents, and the outcome remained uncertain. Axis forces still controlled vast territories in Europe and North Africa, and German armies pressed deep into the Soviet Union. Yet beneath the surface of apparent dominance, momentum began to shift. The conflict was no longer defined solely by defense. The Allied powers, strengthened by industrial mobilization and coordinated strategy, prepared to reclaim initiative. Winston Churchill recognized that symbolic and strategic victories were essential to sustaining morale at home and confidence among allies abroad. In North Africa, British forces under new leadership regrouped after early setbacks and confronted Axis troops in a decisive campaign. The victory at El Alamein in late 1942 marked a critical turning point, halting Axis expansion toward the Suez Canal and securing vital supply routes. Churchill famously declared, "This is not the end, it is not even the beginning of the end, but it is, perhaps, the end of the beginning." The success in North Africa demonstrated that Axis forces could be defeated in sustained ground operations. Allied landings in French North Africa soon followed, tightening pressure from multiple directions. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the brutal Battle of Stalingrad signaled that German advances could be reversed at enormous cost. Though Britain was not the central actor in that struggle, Churchill understood that global coordination against Hitler's regime was yielding tangible results. Strategic bombing campaigns intensified over occupied Europe, targeting industrial centers and transport networks. The war effort became increasingly interconnected, with production in American factories, Soviet resistance on the Eastern Front, and British naval control all reinforcing one another. Churchill's leadership during this period required balancing optimism with realism. Victories offered hope, but losses and sacrifices remained constant reminders of the war's scale. The turning tide did not arrive in a single dramatic moment. It emerged through cumulative pressure, economic, military, and psychological. Britain's survival in 1940 had preserved a base of resistance. By 1942 and 1943, that resistance evolved into coordinated offense. The strategic initiative, once firmly in Axis hands, began to erode. For Churchill, these developments validated the decision to reject negotiation when Britain stood alone. Endurance had bought opportunity. Opportunity now translated into momentum. The war was far from over, but the inevitability of Axis expansion had been broken. The path toward liberation of Europe, though long and costly, had begun to take shape. By 1943, the question confronting the Allied leadership was no longer whether Germany could be resisted, but how and where to strike decisively. The Mediterranean campaigns had weakened Axis control in North Africa and opened new strategic possibilities, yet the liberation of Western Europe required a direct return to the continent. Within conference rooms in London, Washington, and later Tehran, military planners debated the scale, timing, and risks of a cross-channel invasion. The stakes were immense. A premature assault could result in catastrophic loss, while delay risked prolonging the war and deepening destruction. Winston Churchill approached these discussions with a mixture of caution and strategic calculation. He had long favored operations in the Mediterranean, viewing it as a route to weaken Germany's southern flank and safeguard imperial interests. American planners, however, pressed for a bold and direct invasion of northern France to open a second front against Hitler's forces. The debates were not merely tactical. They reflected differing assessments of geography, logistics, and political consequence. At the Tehran Conference in late 1943, Churchill joined President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Soviet leader Joseph Stalin in shaping the next phase of Allied strategy. Stalin, whose armies bore the brunt of combat on the Eastern Front, demanded a firm commitment to a Western invasion that would relieve pressure on Soviet forces. The agreement to launch Operation Overlord in 1944 marked a decisive alignment of Allied priorities. Planning now shifted from theory to execution. The scale of preparation was unprecedented. Thousands of ships, landing craft, aircraft, and vehicles were assembled across southern England. Troops trained for amphibious assault, while engineers devised elaborate deception operations to mislead German intelligence. Harbors were constructed in secret, supply chains coordinated across oceans, and weather patterns studied with meticulous attention. The invasion would not rely solely on bravery. It required industrial precision and synchronized effort. Churchill understood that the coming operation would define Britain's wartime legacy. Success would accelerate liberation and validate years of endurance. Failure would reverberate politically and militarily across the Allied coalition. His public statements remained measured, emphasizing unity and resolve rather than triumphalism. Behind closed doors, he grappled with the magnitude of responsibility that accompanied the decision. As spring 1944 approached, the Allied forces stood poised along the English coast, facing the narrow stretch of water that separated them from occupied France. The Channel, once a defensive barrier, had become a gateway to Europe's future. The return to the continent would not merely challenge German defenses, it would determine the shape of post-war power and the balance that followed Hitler's defeat. Before dawn on June 6, 1944, the stillness of the English Channel gave way to the largest amphibious invasion in history. Thousands of ships moved in coordinated formation toward the coast of Normandy, carrying Allied troops who had trained for months in secrecy and anticipation. Paratroopers had already descended inland under cover of darkness, tasked with securing bridges and disrupting German communications. The scale of Operation Overlord reflected years of planning and the combined industrial strength of the Allied coalition. Winston Churchill understood that this moment represented more than a military maneuver. It was the physical return of Britain and its allies to the continent from which they had been forced back in 1940. The beaches of Normandy, coded as Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, became immediate arenas of intense combat. Defensive fortifications, rough seas, and confusion in the opening hours threatened to derail the carefully orchestrated plan. Yet despite heavy resistance, footholds were established. The landings did not produce instant breakthrough. Casualties were significant, and progress inland was slow and costly. However, the success of the initial assault shattered the myth of German impregnable defenses in Western Europe. Within weeks, additional troops, armor, and supplies poured across the Channel through temporary harbors and secured ports. The bridgehead expanded, gradually pushing German forces into retreat. Churchill followed developments with intense focus, aware that the invasion's outcome would influence not only the war's duration, but the post-war balance of power. The Western Front, long demanded by the Soviet Union, had finally materialized. Allied armies now advanced from both east and west, tightening pressure on Hitler's regime. Liberation of occupied territories began in earnest, restoring governments in exile and reigniting hopes long suppressed under occupation. As Paris was liberated in August 1944 and Allied forces moved toward Germany's borders, the momentum of the war shifted irreversibly. The return to Europe symbolized the culmination of Britain's years of endurance under bombardment and isolation. Churchill's early defiance had preserved a platform from which this offensive could launch. The channel that once separated survival from invasion had become the passage through which liberation advanced. D-Day did not end the war, but it marked the beginning of the end for Nazi domination in Western Europe. It demonstrated the power of coordinated alliance and the consequences of sustained resistance. For Churchill, it affirmed that resolve in 1940 had not been misplaced. The long-awaited return had come, and with it, the promise that tyranny would be confronted on its own ground. By late 1944, the Allied advance across Western Europe accelerated, though not without fierce resistance. German forces, retreating but still formidable, launched counteroffensives in a final effort to fracture Allied momentum. The Battle of the Bulge in the Ardennes tested coordination and supply lines during the harsh winter months, briefly disrupting the advance toward the Rhine. Yet, the offensive ultimately failed, exhausting Germany's remaining reserves and confirming that the strategic initiative had shifted irreversibly. Winston Churchill observed these developments with cautious determination. Victory was visible on the horizon, but the cost remained heavy and the outcome not yet sealed. Allied armies crossed the Rhine in early 1945, breaking through one of Germany's last major defensive barriers. The industrial heartland of the Ruhr fell under sustained assault, further crippling the regime's capacity to continue the war. At the same time, the Red Army advanced relentlessly from the east, converging toward Berlin through territories ravaged by years of occupation and combat. The convergence of Allied forces from opposite directions symbolized both military cooperation and the emerging geopolitical tension that would shape the post-war order. Churchill recognized that the manner in which Germany collapsed would influence the structure of Europe that followed. Even as victory approached, calculations about spheres of influence and political alignment intensified. Within Britain, anticipation of peace mingled with exhaustion. Cities still bore scars from bombing, and families counted losses that would not be reversed by triumph. Churchill's speeches during this period balanced celebration with sobriety, acknowledging sacrifice while reinforcing unity. He framed the approaching end not as a moment of vengeance, but as restoration, the re-establishment of lawful order in a continent shattered by dictatorship. When Germany formally surrendered in May 1945, church bells rang across Britain for the first time in years. Victory in Europe Day marked the culmination of a struggle that had begun in isolation and uncertainty. Crowds gathered in London, filling streets with relief and gratitude. Yet Churchill himself remained mindful that peace would demand as much foresight as war had required courage. The road to victory had been long and uneven, shaped by endurance in 1940, alliance in 1941, turning points in 1942 and 1943, and the decisive return to Europe in 1944. Britain's survival had enabled coalition, and coalition had secured triumph. As celebrations echoed through the capital, Churchill faced the reality that a new chapter, political reconstruction and global realignment, was about to begin. On the 8th of May, 1945, as news of Germany's unconditional surrender spread across Britain, crowds filled the streets in spontaneous celebration. Flags appeared in windows, church bells rang, and for the first time in years, the threat of invasion and bombardment seemed to recede into memory. Winston Churchill stepped onto the balcony overlooking Whitehall, greeted by cheers from a nation that had endured 5 years of war. For many, he was the embodiment of survival and defiance. Yet even amid jubilation, the political landscape was shifting. Churchill had led a wartime coalition government that united parties under the singular objective of defeating Hitler. With victory secured in Europe, that coalition dissolved and Britain prepared to return to peacetime politics. The public mood, shaped by rationing, sacrifice, and social upheaval, now turned toward reconstruction and domestic reform. Wartime leadership didn't automatically translate into electoral certainty. In July 1945, Britain held a general election. The result surprised observers at home and abroad. Churchill's Conservative Party was defeated by the Labour Party under Clement Attlee. The outcome did not reflect rejection of wartime leadership, but rather a desire for social change and expanded welfare policies. Many voters sought economic security, housing reform, and a restructured society after years of deprivation. The electorate separated gratitude for wartime resolve from expectations for peacetime governance. Churchill accepted the result with dignity, stepping aside as prime minister even as he remained a towering public figure. His defeat underscored the resilience of British democratic institutions, a system that had continued functioning even under the pressure of total war. Power transferred peacefully, reinforcing the very principles Britain had claimed to defend against authoritarian rule. Internationally, Churchill's voice did not fade. Though no longer Prime Minister, he remained deeply engaged in shaping post-war discourse. His warnings about Soviet expansion and the future of Europe would soon re-enter global conversation, demonstrating that his influence extended beyond formal office. The end of war marked not the end of his role, but a transformation in its character. Victory had brought relief, but it also introduced new challenges. Britain faced economic strain, imperial reconsideration, and the emerging tension between former allies. Churchill's wartime leadership had preserved national independence. Now the nation turned inward to redefine its future. The transition from war to peace revealed that history does not pause at triumph. It moves forward into new uncertainties. In March 1946, less than a year after victory in Europe, Winston Churchill stood before an audience at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, invited by U.S. President Harry S. Truman. Churchill no longer held the office of Prime Minister, yet his voice carried global authority. The war had ended, but peace felt fragile and unsettled. Across Central and Eastern Europe, Soviet influence was consolidating, and the political map of the continent was shifting in ways that concerned many Western observers. In his address, Churchill delivered a phrase that would define the emerging era. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. The metaphor captured what diplomatic language often obscured: a growing division between East and West, structured by ideology, security interests, and military presence. He did not call for renewed conflict, but for clarity and unity among democratic nations. The speech framed post-war tension not as misunderstanding, but as structural transformation. The address sparked immediate controversy. Some critics argued that Churchill's tone risked provoking confrontation with the Soviet Union, while others viewed it as an honest assessment of geopolitical reality. In Moscow, the speech was interpreted as hostile, reinforcing suspicions that the West sought to contain or undermine Soviet security. Yet, among many in Britain and the United States, it crystallized concerns that wartime cooperation had given way to strategic rivalry. Churchill's warning was rooted in his wartime experience. He had witnessed how quickly balance could collapse when aggressive power went unchecked. To him, strength and alliance were not instruments of provocation, but safeguards against instability. The speech emphasized cooperation between the United States and Britain as the foundation of peace, arguing that unity would deter further expansion rather than encourage it. The Iron Curtain speech marked a transition from wartime alliance to Cold War awareness. Churchill, once the voice of resistance against Hitler, now became an early voice identifying the contours of a new geopolitical struggle. The line he described was not yet fortified with walls and barbed wire across its entire length, but its political outline was unmistakable. In speaking plainly about division, Churchill influenced how the post-war world understood itself. His words did not create the divide, but they gave it language. The voice that had rallied Britain in 1940 now helped define the global order that followed. Victory had been achieved, yet a new era of guarded peace had begun. By the time the 20th century moved into its second half, Winston Churchill had become more than a wartime leader. He had become a symbol of democratic endurance under existential threat. His speeches from 1940 were no longer simply parliamentary records. They were studied as examples of leadership under pressure, moments when language helped shape national destiny. The Britain he led through bombardment and isolation had survived long enough to form alliances that ultimately secured victory. His voice, once carried by fragile radio waves, had echoed across continents. Churchill's legacy rests not solely on military decisions or diplomatic maneuvering, but on the psychological architecture he constructed during crisis. In 1940, Britain stood alone against a seemingly unstoppable force. Political compromise was discussed, invasion feared, and defeat conceivable. Yet Churchill framed resistance as both necessity and moral obligation, transforming vulnerability into collective resolve. That shift in perception altered the trajectory of the war. His career, however, was not without complexity. He presided over an empire at a moment when imperial structures were beginning to unravel, and his views on global politics reflected the assumptions of his era. Post-war Britain would change rapidly, redefining its role in a world no longer centered on European dominance. Churchill's defeat in 1945 demonstrated that democratic systems endure beyond individual leaders, even those who guide nations through their darkest hours. Internationally, his early warnings about Soviet expansion proved influential in shaping Western strategy during the Cold War. The phrase "Iron Curtain" became shorthand for the division of Europe, anchoring the vocabulary of a new geopolitical order. Churchill's post-war influence extended into debates about alliance, deterrence, and the balance of power, themes that would define decades of global politics. In later years, he returned briefly to the premiership, but the defining chapter of his public life remained the years of defiance against Hitler. When he died in 1965, he was honored not merely as a statesman, but as a figure whose leadership had intersected with the fate of nations. Ceremonies reflected both national gratitude and international recognition of his historical significance. Churchill's story is ultimately one of voice and will. He did not command the largest army nor control the greatest industrial capacity at the outset of war. What he possessed was conviction, the ability to articulate danger without surrendering to it. In moments when fear threatened to overwhelm policy, he chose language that fortified rather than fractured. The voice that defied Hitler did not win the war alone. Victory emerged from alliance, sacrifice, and global effort. Yet without that voice in 1940, the chain of events that followed might have unfolded differently. Churchill's enduring legacy lies in the reminder that leadership, at critical junctures, can alter history not only through force, but through faith in resistance.